Jake leaned back in his chair, staring at the blank screen of his laptop. The cursor blinked, as if mocking his indecision. This was it, the moment he had been planning for years. He had spent too many nights watching travel vlogs, reading expat blogs, and daydreaming about a life far from the structured and monotonous routine that had defined his existence. The Texas sun had grown unbearable, the predictability of his 9 to 5 suffocating. He wanted something different. He needed something different. The Philippines had always intrigued him. The vibrant culture, the stunning beaches, the promise of a lower cost of living, a fresh start. It was not running away, or at least that's what he told himself. He was moving towards something new, something better. Freedom. The word had a weight to it that he hadn't fully understood until now. His decision wasn't impulsive. He had been saving for years, cutting back on unnecessary expenses, slowly detaching himself from the life he had built in the States. The day he resigned from his job, his boss had looked at him like he was insane. People didn't just leave everything behind. But Jake was not like most people. He had never felt truly at home in Texas, in its sprawling highways and corporate mindset. He wanted to wake up to something new every day. Not the same coffee shop, not the same conversations about mortgages and promotions and retirement plans. His friends had been skeptical. They had warned him about the risks: culture shock, financial instability, loneliness. But Jake had brushed it off. He had done his research. The Philippines had a thriving expat community, and he had secured a remote job that would provide him with a steady income. He wasn't going in blind, he was going in prepared. Or at least, that's what he thought. The days leading up to his departure were a blur. Packing his life into a few suitcases had been surprisingly easy. He sold most of his belongings, keeping only the essentials. He didn't need much: a laptop, some clothes, a few sentimental items. He told himself he was ready. But as he sat in the airport, waiting for his flight, doubt crept in. Was he really making the right choice? The plane ride was long, filled with a mix of excitement and anxiety. He watched the in-flight map, tracing the miles as he moved further from the only life he had ever known. He imagined what it would be like to step off the plane, to feel the humid air, to hear the unfamiliar sounds of a new country. He had been to the Philippines once before on vacation, but this was different. This was permanent. When he landed in Manila, the first thing that hit him was the heat. It wrapped around him like a heavy blanket, thick and inescapable. The airport was chaotic, filled with voices speaking a mix of English and Tagalog. He followed the crowd, his suitcase dragging behind him as he navigated through customs and immigration. Outside, the city was alive. Traffic was a mess of honking cars and weaving motorcycles. Bright billboards lit up the night, advertising brands he barely recognized. Street vendors called out, selling everything from grilled meats to fresh fruit. The smell of exhaust mixed with the aroma of food, creating a scent that was both overwhelming and oddly comforting. He took a cab to his Airbnb, watching as the city blurred past his window. Manila was nothing like home. It was chaotic, unfiltered, raw. But there was an energy to it that he couldn't ignore. This was what he had wanted. Something different. His Airbnb was a small condo in Makati. Modern and clean, but much smaller than what he was used to. He unpacked methodically, trying to create some sense of normalcy. His bed felt unfamiliar, the pillows too soft, the air conditioning humming too loudly. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, the reality of his decision sinking in. The next morning, he set out to explore. He wandered through the streets, dodging jeepneys and tricycles, taking in the sights and sounds. He tried local food, struggling to pronounce the names of dishes but enjoying the flavors nonetheless. People were friendly, smiling at him, curious about the lone foreigner navigating their city. But there was something else, something he hadn't fully anticipated. The stares, the questions, the assumptions. He was a foreigner, an outsider, and that was something he would never be able to change. Some people saw him as an opportunity, others as a curiosity. He felt both welcomed and alienated at the same time. That night, he sat on the balcony of his condo, looking out at the city lights. He had made it. He had done what so many only dreamed of. But as the initial excitement wore off, the weight of his decision settled on his shoulders. This was not a vacation. This was his life now. Was he ready for this? Was he truly prepared for what lay ahead? He had always thought of himself as adaptable, as someone who thrived on change. But this was different. This was not just a new job or a new city. This was a new culture, a new way of life. And no amount of research could have fully prepared him for that. As he lay in bed, exhaustion finally taking over, he realized that this was only the beginning. The real challenge was yet to come. Jake woke up to the muffled sounds of the city below. The early morning hustle had already begun. Car horns, the chatter of street vendors, the distant hum of motorcycles weaving through the streets. Manila never seemed to sleep, and neither did his thoughts. He lay in bed for a few moments, trying to shake the disoriented feeling that came with waking up in a new place. It still didn't feel real. The air smelled different, a mix of warm pavement and frying garlic from the street stalls below. The ceiling above him was unfamiliar, and for a brief second, he felt the instinct to check his phone for messages from back home, only to remember that he had left that life behind. He pushed himself up, his body heavy from jet lag, and made his way to the small kitchen. His Airbnb was modern, a sleek studio in the heart of Makati, but it lacked the warmth of a real home. It was temporary, just a starting point, until he figured out something more permanent. He made coffee, the strong aroma filling the small space, and stared out the window. From this high up, he could see the city stretching endlessly, a tangled mess of buildings, billboards, and roads clogged with traffic. It was nothing like Texas. There were no wide-open highways, no sprawling suburban neighborhoods, just an endless maze of movement, life packed into every corner. He needed to get out. He hadn't come all this way to sit inside, so he showered, dressed, and stepped out into the heat. The air was thick, humid, and almost suffocating. Sweat formed instantly on the back of his neck as he walked down the street, past rows of food carts selling everything from skewered meats to sweet rice cakes. He could smell the charred scent of barbecue, hear the sizzling of something frying in hot oil. The aroma made his stomach growl, but he wasn't ready to eat just yet. He needed to get his bearings first. Navigating the city was an immediate challenge. Traffic was chaos. Jeepneys rumbled past, packed with passengers clinging to the metal bars, their bodies pressed tightly together. Tricycles weaved in and out, ignoring any semblance of road rules. Pedestrians moved like water, slipping between cars with an ease that baffled him. He hesitated at crosswalks, unsure of when to step forward, while locals darted confidently across without a second thought. He wandered aimlessly, absorbing everything. Small shops lined the streets, selling everything from phone accessories to cheap clothing. A man sat on the sidewalk repairing a broken sandal, his hands moving with practiced precision. Children played barefoot near a drainage ditch, their laughter rising above the noise of the city. Everywhere he looked, there was life, movement, struggle, resilience. Eventually, he found himself at a small cafe. Drawn in by the promise of air conditioning, he ordered an iced coffee, grateful for the relief from the heat, and took a seat by the window. The cafe was quiet, filled with young professionals typing away on laptops, college students chatting softly. It was one of the few places that felt somewhat familiar, modern, clean, comfortable. But even here, he felt the weight of being an outsider. The occasional glance, the curious looks, it was subtle, but he noticed it. He wasn't just another face in the crowd, he stood out. As he sipped his coffee, he pulled out his phone and checked his messages. A few from old coworkers, some from friends back home, mostly asking how he was settling in. He didn't respond right away. What was he supposed to say? That he felt both exhilarated and completely lost? That the excitement of starting over was already giving way to an unsettling sense of isolation? He closed his phone and leaned back, watching the city through the glass. He had expected the culture shock, the adjustment period. But expecting something and experiencing it were two different things. He had spent years preparing for this move, and yet in just 24 hours, he already felt like he had underestimated what it meant to uproot his life. Would it get easier? Would he find his place here? He had no choice but to find out. Finishing his coffee, he stepped back into the heat and kept walking, determined to push through the discomfort. Because this wasn't a vacation, this was his new life, and he had to figure out how to live it. Jake woke up in complete darkness, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliarity of his surroundings. The air was still thick with the remnants of the day's humidity. The faint hum of his air conditioning unit had vanished. Then he realized another power outage. He groaned, rubbing his face as beads of sweat already began to form on his skin. He fumbled for his phone, the screen casting a pale glow over the small condo as he checked the time. It was barely past 3 in the morning. Outside, the distant sounds of the city continue, occasional car horns, the murmur of voices, the faint barking of stray dogs. Manila never truly slept. This was the third time this week that the electricity had gone out in the middle of the night. Back in Texas, this would have been a major inconvenience, but here, it was just another part of life. Rolling blackouts were common, especially in certain areas. He had been warned, but experiencing it firsthand was different. The sudden silence, the way the absence of air conditioning made the heat feel even more oppressive, the way the darkness seemed to stretch out longer than it should at all made him feel strangely alone. He tossed the blanket off his body, already sticky with sweat, and pushed himself up from the bed. If there was no power, there was no point in trying to sleep. He grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge, relieved to find that it was still cold, at least for now. He stood by the window, watching as the city remained alive despite the outage. Neon lights flickered in the distance, and the occasional headlights from passing cars painted streaks across the buildings. This was something he hadn't truly prepared for, the small inconveniences, the way they piled up and tested his patience. It wasn't just the power outages. It was the way traffic made even the simplest trips an ordeal, the way the humidity clung to his skin like a second layer, the way he constantly felt like he was balancing between fascination and frustration. The excitement of his move was starting to settle into reality. He had made a promise to himself before coming here. He would embrace the change. He wouldn't be one of those expats who complained about every little thing, who compared everything to life back in the States. But now, standing in the darkness of his overheated condo, he had to admit adjusting was harder than he had expected. The next morning, with the power finally restored, he decided he needed to get out. He had spent too much time in his apartment, thinking, overanalyzing. If he wanted to feel like he belonged here, he had to start living like it. He took a cold shower, the water shocking his system awake, and dressed in the lightest clothing he could find. The plan was simple: explore, find a good meal, and figure out what the hell he was doing with his life. Stepping out onto the street, the city greeted him with its usual intensity. The heat was immediate, wrapping around him like a heavy blanket. Vendors were already set up, grilling meats on small charcoal stoves, the scent of smoke and spices filling the air. He passed by a group of kids playing basketball barefoot on the cracked pavement, their laughter echoing between buildings. A man on the corner was selling fresh mangoes, his knife moving effortlessly as he sliced the fruit into neat cubes. He walked with no real direction, letting the city guide him. He had read about this, the idea of getting lost on purpose, of allowing himself to discover things organically rather than following a checklist. And it worked. He found himself in a crowded market, the kind that was chaotic but full of life. Stalls selling fresh seafood, dried fish hanging in rows, the pungent smell mixing with the sweetness of tropical fruits piled high in wooden crates. He watched as a woman expertly balanced a basket of vegetables on her head, weaving through the crowd without spilling a single item. A vendor caught his eye and waved him over. The man was selling balut, the infamous fertilized duck egg that Jake had seen in travel shows but had never dared to try. "You try, sir?" the vendor asked, grinning as he held up an egg. Jake hesitated. He had sworn he would be open to new experiences, but this was a test. He had heard stories about foreigners gagging at the sight of the partially developed duck embryo inside. He took a breath. This was why he was here to step outside of his comfort zone. "All right," he said, pulling out a few pesos and handing them over. The vendor expertly cracked the egg, peeling back the shell to reveal the soft, warm contents. Jake watched as the man sprinkled a bit of salt and handed it to him. He felt the eyes of those around him, watching, waiting. He brought it to his lips and took a bite. The taste was rich, slightly gamey, but not as bad as he had expected. He chewed slowly, nodding as he swallowed. The vendor laughed, clapping him on the back. "Very good, sir. You eat like Filipino now." Jake grinned, wiping his mouth. He had done it. It was a small thing, but in that moment, it felt like a step forward. He spent the rest of the day wandering, trying more street food, talking to locals when he could. He still felt like an outsider, but for the first time since arriving, he also felt like he belonged, even if just a little. By the time he returned to his condo, exhaustion had set in, but it was the good kind, the kind that came from living, from experiencing. He sat by the window again, watching the city move beneath him. Maybe he hadn't figured everything out yet. Maybe he never truly would. But today, he had taken a step. And for now, that was enough. Jake had always prided himself on being adaptable. Back in Texas, he had moved cities, changed jobs, adjusted to new environments without much trouble. But here, in the relentless, unpredictable chaos of Manila, he was beginning to question that belief. It had been weeks since he arrived, and while some things had started to feel familiar, the route to the nearest convenience store, the way the city never truly went quiet, the constant layering of smells that ranged from sweet mangoes to burning rubber other things, continued to leave him exhausted. No matter how much he tried to blend in, he was always the outsider. The way people glanced at him, sometimes curious, sometimes with open amusement, reminded him of that daily. But he had made a choice to be here, to start over in a place where everything felt alive in a way he had never experienced before. He just hadn't expected the weight of that decision to settle on his shoulders quite like this. The biggest challenge wasn't the heat, nor the noise, nor the way traffic operated like an intricate dance that he had yet to learn the steps to. It was something much deeper, something he hadn't anticipated. It was the family culture. Jake had grown up in a household where independence was expected. At 18, he had moved out, found his own place, paid his own bills. His parents had always supported him, but from a distance, letting him carve his own path. That was the American way. You stood on your own, you built your own success. Here, though, things worked differently. It had started with Angela. He had met her at a small cafe in Makati, one of the few places he had found comfort in. She had been kind, effortlessly charming, and had made him feel less like an outsider in a city that often reminded him that he didn't belong. Their conversations had started light travel, food, the strange quirks of living in Manila, but as time went on, things grew deeper. Angela came from a large family. She was the eldest daughter, responsible in ways Jake had never fully understood. He had always liked that about her warmth, her dedication to those she loved. But he hadn't realized what it truly meant. The first time he visited her home, he was overwhelmed. The house was small, yet filled with people. Aunts, uncles, cousins, even a few neighbors who seemed to come and go as if they lived there. The noise was constant laughter, chatter, a television playing in the background, the clatter of plates in the kitchen. He had never seen anything like it. He had smiled, nodded, done his best to take it all in stride. But the truth was, he had no idea what he was walking into. Because in the Philippines, relationships weren't just between two people. They extended outward, pulling in family, tradition, obligation. Angela's father had sized him up almost immediately. Not in an aggressive way, but in a way that made it clear this wasn't just about dating his daughter. This was about whether Jake could fit into the intricate web of expectations that came with being part of a Filipino family. The questions had started subtly at first. What do you do for work? Do you have family back home? Do you like it here? But then came the real ones. Are you serious about Angela? What are your plans for the future? And perhaps the most difficult one, you know, here we take care of each other. Jake had nodded, unsure of what to say. In the US, dating was simple. You met someone, spent time with them, and if things worked out, you built a life together. Families were involved, but not like this. Here, love came with responsibility. He saw it in the way Angela sent money to her parents, even though she lived on her own. He saw it in the way she always put her siblings first, rearranging her schedule to help her younger brother with schoolwork or to take her mother to a doctor's appointment. And more than anything, he saw it in the expectation that eventually, if things became serious, he would be part of that responsibility too. It wasn't about money, though that was part of it. It was about something deeper, the idea that family wasn't just immediate relatives. It was everyone. And when you became involved with someone, you became part of that network. For Jake, this was overwhelming. Back home, success was measured by independence. Here, it was measured by how well you took care of those around you. One night, as they sat in a quiet corner of a small restaurant, Angela finally asked the question he had been dreading. Do you think you could handle this? Jake hesitated, pushing his food around his plate. Handle what? Angela smiled, but there was something behind her eye, something cautious. My family, my life here, the way we do things. He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. I don't know, he admitted. It's different from what I'm used to. She nodded, as if she had expected that answer. I know it's a lot, but Jake, this is who I am. And that was when it hit him. This wasn't just about whether he could adapt to the heat or the traffic or the language barriers. This was about whether he could truly embrace a way of life that was so fundamentally different from his own. He cared about Angela. That much he knew. But was he ready to take on not just a relationship, but an entire cultural expectation? He had thought moving to a new country would be the hardest part. But maybe the hardest part was realizing that to truly belong here, he couldn't just be an observer. He had to become part of it. That night, as he walked back to his condo, the weight of that realization sat heavy on his shoulders. The question wasn't just whether he could love Angela. It was whether he could love everything that came with her. Jake sat in his small condo, the sounds of the city humming beyond the thin walls. The air conditioning rattled in protest as it fought against the relentless Manila heat, barely keeping the room tolerable. He had always imagined that moving to a new country would come with a sense of adventure, a rush of excitement that made every challenge feel like a puzzle waiting to be solved. Instead, he found himself sitting in the dim glow of his laptop, staring at his reflection on the dark screen, wondering if he had made a mistake. It wasn't just about adapting to a new place anymore. That part he had expected: the traffic, the humidity, the noise, the endless ways life in Manila clashed with the quiet predictability of Texas. What he hadn't expected was the feeling of being watched. Not in a sinister way, not by strangers or passersby, but by something much more overwhelming. Angela's family, it had started slowly. A message from her younger brother asking if Jake wanted to meet up for coffee. Then her mother sending small gift-show-made snacks, a carefully wrapped package of dried mangoes, a handwritten note in English thanking him for being kind to Angela. At first, it had seemed sweet, a level of warmth he had never experienced before. But then, it became more. Every time he and Angela went out, someone from her family seemed to know. An aunt would comment about their dinner choice before he had even posted anything online. A cousin would casually mention that Angela had been spending a lot of time in Makati, an unspoken hint that they were keeping track of her whereabouts. It wasn't done maliciously. It wasn't even done consciously. It was just part of life here. The idea that family was involved not just in the big moments, but in the daily ones, the mundane ones, the ones Jake had always considered private. And the hardest part, Angela didn't see the problem. "This is just how we are," she had said one night as they sat on the balcony of his condo, the city stretching endlessly beyond them. "We look out for each other." Jake had nodded, pretending to understand. But the truth was, he didn't. Not really. In America, privacy was sacred. You lived your life, and outside of holidays or major events, your family wasn't involved in every detail. Here, family wasn't just a presence, it was a force, one that shaped decisions, relationships, even emotions. And the expectations were starting to weigh on him. It had started small questions from Angela's relatives about his job, his family, his long-term plans. But as the weeks passed, the questions grew deeper. When will you visit her family in the province? Have you thought about getting a place closer to her? What are your plans for Angela? That last question had hit him the hardest, because it wasn't just about dating. Here, relationships weren't casual. If you were serious, you were serious. And if you weren't, you were wasting their time. Angela's father had made that clear. They had met once, at a small family gathering where Jake had done his best to be polite, to smile, to fit in. But after dinner, when they were alone for a brief moment, her father had leaned in, his voice calm but firm. "You are a good man," he had said. "But understand something. Angela is not just dating you, she is bringing you into her life, and her life includes all of us." Jake had nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle into his chest. That night, as he lay in bed, he couldn't stop thinking about it. The idea that being with Angela meant more than just being with her. It meant becoming part of a system he barely understood, a system that didn't function the way he was used to. He thought about his own parents, how they had never interfered in his relationships,